Hi everybody, and welcome to another Sticky3D Controller tutorial. In this tutorial, we'll be looking at reference frames, which are one of the core components of the controller. The first question that probably comes to your mind is, what is a reference frame? To answer that question, let's imagine an example where we would want to use a reference frame. So let's suppose you're making some sort of space game. You want to have a player walk around on a spaceship flying through your scene, then get out of the spaceship and walk onto a space station it's docked with. But if you try and get a normal character controller to do this, you run into two main issues. So firstly, the character won't rotate with the ship. If the ship turns to the left, the player will remain facing the same direction in world space. So in the ship, it will seem as if the player has turned right of their own accord. If the ship rolls, the player will remain standing in the world up direction, not tilting with the floor of the ship. Secondly, and probably more importantly, the player won't move with the ship. When the ship starts moving forward, the player will remain where they are in world space, but from the player's point of view, it will seem as though they are suddenly pulled backwards towards the rear of the ship. There are other issues as well. For one thing, trying to manage all of this with the transition to the space station. The overall problem here is that the player is always moving relative to world space. What we want the player to do instead is move relative to the spaceship. To the player, if they are unable to look out the windows of the spaceship or hear the sounds of the engines, they shouldn't be able to tell that the spaceship is moving at all. In other words, it should be just like moving around on the ground. Sticky3D Controller's reference frames are designed to solve this problem. Reference frames are objects that you designate that the character controller should move relative to. In the previous example, while the player was on the spaceship, the reference frame would be the spaceship game object, and when the player was on the space station, the reference frame would be the space station game object. So, now that we know about what reference frames are, how do we use them? As I said before, reference frames are simply game objects in your scene. Once a reference frame is set for your character controller, it will move with that game object and use that game object's rotation as a reference. To start modifying the reference frame settings for our character, we want to go into the Collide tab of our Sticky3D controller. The first setting that we want to look at here is the reference update type setting, which basically determines how we are controlling which reference frame we're in. There are two basic methods for controlling the reference frame, manual and automatic. The third option, auto first, is a blend of the two that I will talk about a bit later. The simplest option is automatic. When this is active, the character controller will continuously look at the collider that is directly underneath the character. If this collider's object is different to the current reference frame object, and is not a child of the current reference frame object, it will change the reference frame to this new object. So basically, the reference frame will always be what the character is standing on. To demonstrate this, let me show you what happens in the scene if we have the reference update type set to automatic. If I walk onto the moving platform, when the moving platform moves, we move it with it now. If you want a bit more selective control over which reference frame is used, you'll want to use the manual option. The manual option gives you two different ways of controlling the reference frame. You can either set it in code, or you can use sticky zones. To look at how we can use sticky zones, let's take a look at this object in the scene. You probably saw this earlier, spinning in the background. The idea is that we want the player to be able to walk on all four sides of the box. This isn't possible using the automatic option, as only one side of the cube is designated the up direction, so we would only be able to walk on that side. We can, however, achieve this with sticky zones. A sticky zone is basically a trigger to enter a reference frame. I've created 4 on this box, 1 on each side. Let's take a look at the first one. The typical sticky zone setup is what I have here. You have an object which has a sticky zone component and a collider with the is trigger option enabled. Whenever a character controller using the manual option enters the trigger, it will switch to using the reference frame specified in the reference transform variable of the sticky zone component. If the restore's default ref option is enabled, the initial reference frame, which I'll talk about next, will be restored to the character controller when it leaves the trigger collider. So now, if we go back to the character controller, ensure that the reference update type is set to manual, and then hit play. Now I can walk onto the spinning cube and move with it. The last point I need to talk about is the initial reference frame option on the character controller. If we go back to the character controller, we can see that there is a setting for the initial reference frame. This defines what the reference frame is when the game starts. We also have the last option for reference update type, auto first. If I set it here, this basically works exactly the same as manual, but when the game starts, overrides the initial reference frame with whatever the character is standing on, just as if we were using the automatic mode. That's all for this tutorial. I hope that was helpful to you. If you have any questions about reference frames or anything else in Sticky3D Controller, feel free to ask us on our forum or in our Discord. Thank you for watching.